Good evening. I am Dr. May, Chair of the Department of History and Philosophy, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Wayne Lee from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He is the Professor of Military History there, and he's also the author of several books including Barbarians and Brothers, Crowds and Soldiers, Warfare and Culture in World History, and he has also appeared on the show Deadliest Warrior representing George Washington. So, no further ado, Dr. Wayne Lee.
It's not much. To go through life looking that down, that's not my major qualification, having appeared on The Deadliest Warrior. That we were just up here exchanging stories about that experience. I assume you all know that he was on it too, so that we can share that shame. It's quite a silly show. And it cheats. Regularly changes the conditions to make it come out the way they want it to come out. But that's another story. What I want to do today is, Professor May introduced me as a military historian, and I am. So you're going to probably have a set of expectations about the kind of things I'm going to talk about. There's going to be battles, there's going to be soldiers, there's going to be armies. And that's going to be true, but it's going to take a while for us to get there. Because what I want to do is something a little different. I'm often accused of being something of a cultural military historian, which is a shorthand way for saying I'm really interested in getting inside of people's heads. And I'm interested in getting inside of people's heads in regards to what they thought about war and how they reacted to it and what made them angry, what made them want to start a war, what made them want to end it. And that is the major question that sort of motivates me as I work in military history. And as I was working on one of the books that Professor May mentioned, The Barbarians and Brothers, there's a story in there that I'm going to get to by the end that I'm not sure I yet understand it. And in trying to understand it, after I'd written it, after the book was done, I started exploring other ways of looking inside people's heads and trying to understand that story anew. And that's really what this talk is about. And so I'm going to take you on a tour through the way people in the early modern world, that is Europe and North America, the early modern Western world, thought about death. And one of the things that we do as historians, especially those historians of us who are interested in culture, is that we look for symbols that are used by people in the past to express the meanings that they more or less understand all the time. They're ingrained. They have a set of shared assumptions or shared values that are expressed in their daily lives, but also expressed in the objects that they produce, the objects that they value, the objects that are a part of their lives. And so I am also, in my life, an archaeologist. I've worked in Albania and in Hungary and in Greece and in Virginia. And so I've spent a lot of time analyzing objects and talking to anthropologists about looking for symbolism and meanings in objects. And so it was sort of a natural for me to say, all right, I want to understand more about the soldiers who I'm going to talk about at the end of the story. And I'm going to look at the objects and their understandings of objects that are related to death, because that's where we're going to go at the end. And so this is sort of this combination talk about objects in soldiers' minds and death. Now the first thing to do is to think a little bit about the rarity of objects in the 18th century or the 17th century. I'm going to be looking at a couple of different centuries here. But in the 17th and 18th century, people just didn't own that much. Regular folk, at least. Rich folk could have a lot of things, but for most people, the objects in their possession would be beyond the simply utilitarian, like plows and cups and plates, were relatively rare. I mean, everybody had those, plows and cups and plates and the things that make horses function, the tacks, the bridle, the saddle. But you get beyond that, you don't have very much. And that means that the few objects that you do have would be significant to you. They would have meaning to you. And they would carry meaning. They speak. And that's one of the ways that I'm using this phrase, speaking through skulls. That objects spoke to people in significant ways. And one of my favorite examples is the family Bible. The family Bible on the patriarch's desk was a signifier of something. It was a signifier of permanence and of kin and of hope for the future. You record your children's names in that Bible and you pass it on to the next generation. It was not just a book. It was not even just a book about God. It had something that had much greater meaning than that. So what I want to do today is talk about objects that spoke to or about death. Now, death is obviously a universal experience. Everyone goes through it. But the way societies and cultures respond to death changes over time. And it can be very different not only over time, but in between cultures. Its finality, however, and its universality, however, mean that objects related to it have always had power. Whatever culture you're in or whatever society, and the objects associated with death have had power, and they communicate in deeply, potentially deeply emotive ways. Now consider this as an example. Who knows what this is? How many of you own one? Hanging from your rearview mirror? Or someone you know, your mother has one hanging from her rearview mirror. So usually about 50% of any given audience that I talk to knows or has one of these things. Do you know what it really is? It's a scalp hoop. Right? Go like this. Move your scalp around. Feel the loose flesh on top of the bone where your skull lies, right? When you get killed or nearly killed by a Native American, in most Native American cultural contexts east of Mississippi and also as far as the Rockies, one of the things that's likely to happen to you is that flesh on the top of your skull, which can be easily lifted from the top of your skull with a sharp object, in other words, scalped, comes off. And then you save it. You curate it. You take it home. It's a prize. It's a token of your success as the scalper, right? But that's flesh. It's skin, so it must be treated. How do you treat skin to turn it into leather? You stretch it and dry it. This is a circular surface. It's a disc of flesh. So you make a hoop and you stretch it. You tie the edges of the disc into the hoop like this, so that it's dried and cured. You keep the hair, that's part of the decoration. You paint the fleshy side, that makes it also part of the decoration. You hang it outside your wigwam or your teepee or whatever sort of structure it is you live in, and that becomes a token of your success for everyone else to see. Over time, in modern sort of the New Age approach to Indians that wanted to pacify Native Americans and sort of downplay, for very good reasons, because historically we've been referring to them as savages and all those sorts of other stereotypes that we've been building up about them, we pacified them and made them what I like to call the New Age Indian. And the little disc of leather in the center of that hoop got smaller and smaller and smaller, and the strings got longer and longer and longer until the flesh disappeared and feathers and hair and just string, and we call it a dream catcher. Right? Now, the dream catcher part of it is still real, because the scalp hoop is not just a disc of flesh. It's not just a trophy. It is the capture of the spirit of the person whom you have killed. It is an emblem, but it is also a vessel for spiritual power. It is an object of death that has spiritual power. And what we did with it as a modern American society was to remove the implications of death, but retain the understanding that there was spiritual power involved with this object. Now, you may think, all right, well, people, Native Americans, that's a completely different culture. They're objects of death and these ideas about spiritual power, that's Native Americans. Europeans weren't like that. Well, let me tell you another story in which the objects related to death also had spiritual power, but this time in a European cultural context. This is an object, which obviously I hope you can see as a skull. It's clear enough on this board. It's about this big, the tip of your pinky, which is why it looks so indistinct. This is the back of it, and it would be really hard to see otherwise, so I've ticked out with black pen the little cross that's incised on the back of the skull, and then the 4 letters, RSMD. This was an object that was found by the archaeological project that I was working on in Northern Virginia, in Loudoun County. And it was found underneath the threshold of a door, underneath the threshold of a cabin as you walk in the door inside, under the rotting floorboards of a cabin built in the 1780s, 1790s. And it was one of these great coincidental things about archaeological projects. All the best finds are either in the first shovelful of the season or the last shovelful of the season. Nothing good is ever found in the middle of a project. It's always the beginning or the end. This was the very first shovelful. And it was a pretty extraordinary, it's just big enough not to fall through the 1/4-inch screen. So it was a pretty lucky find. If it had been a little bit smaller, it would have dropped through the screen, we never would have seen it. this took us a while to figure out. Now, to our great fortune, the letters RS or SR, which we initially thought would be, of course, some sort of initial, right? No one in the valley in the 1780s or 1790s had the initials RS or SR, which is a fabulous coincidence because that seems like a pretty easy one to have just by accident. You know, Stephen Robinson or Robert Stevenson. It's a really easy one, SR. But fortunately, no one had that, so we didn't get stuck up on initials. MD was easy because the land was owned by Mahlon Demery. So that seemed clear. MD refers to Mahlon Demery, the man who owned the land at the time when that thing was deposited. What about the SR? Well, this, again, took a while. And it turns out that the eventual clue came from a German language 18th century newspaper printed in Pennsylvania that referred to German magical healing medicine. And it was repeating an old understanding, an old sort of folk wisdom, a sort of folk magic that goes all the way back to the Romans. And it is the Sator Rotas invocation. This is an actual Roman from Portugal inscription, which actually one of my colleagues who worked on the project found in Portugal by accident, where it lays out the Sator Rotas invocation. And you can't see it on this, so I'll show you what it actually looks like when it's written out. This is a boxed palindrome. See how that works? It reads the same way in all directions. And it's Latin. And what it means roughly is the sower arepo is a nonsense name. The sower arepo holds steady the wheel of fortune. And so the boxing quality of the palindrome gives it power. It's like this equivalent, the verbal equivalent of abracadabra. Abracadabra is an invocation. It's a word that you use to invoke spiritual power. You're tapping into the spiritual side of the planet, and you're bringing that power into the material side of the world, and you're changing your environment by bringing in that spiritual power. And this is an ancient Roman invocation that persisted through to 18th century Pennsylvania and Northern Virginia in an abbreviated form, by that time called Sator Rotas, SR. And it was described in that way in this 18th century Pennsylvania newspaper. Now, when you invoke spiritual power, it's neutral. Spiritual power is neutral. It is not good or bad. It's neutral. You then direct it. You do something to that spiritual power with the other symbols that are in play in that environment that points that power in a particular direction, towards a target and for good or for evil. Well, this SR was on a skull, an object of death. This was a curse. It's an invocation directed by the skull as a curse, as a negative force. And who is it directed towards? Mahlon Demery, who owned the land, and whom, we discovered, in about 1790, evicted the tenant who was living in the cabin, who probably then left that skull under the floorboards at the threshold of the house, so that the new occupant would walk back and forth across that cursed skull every day as they went in and out of the house. So that is an object of death, not dissimilar in terms of its understanding of what spiritual power is from an Indian scout. And it suggests the ways in which even an 18th century European could imagine the spirit world as being intimately connected to the material world. And not just connected, but manipulable. That it could be something you could use in relationship to the material world. Now, that's starting to get us a little closer to the soldiers who I'm ultimately interested in. And what we're seeing when you see a story like this is the persistence of a sub or semi-literate culture that continues to imagine death and spiritual power in ways that are unfamiliar to us, or that seem, for the lack of a better word, pre-modern or pagan, although there's clearly also an ongoing interaction with Christianity. So let me tell you another story. In a similar way, I could talk about the London riots that occurred against the barber surgeons that have been described by the historian Peter Linebaugh in 18th century England. In essence, over the course of the 18th century in England, you got the birth of the modern medical study of the body. And as a part of that process, they dissected cadavers. Because you had to. That'd be the only way to really learn about what's going on inside a body. So a market is created for cadavers. There is a demand between different, literally competing institutions of medical training to get cadavers legally, and sometimes illegally, for the purposes of dissection. The English legal system included in its laws the possibility of punishment being not just death, but death and dissection. In other words, if you've really screwed up or pissed off the judge, then when he condemns you to be hung, he will also condemn you to be dissected, which was considered problematic. People didn't like the idea. In fact, people didn't like the idea so much that when a criminal went to the public hanging, because hangings were major public events, almost like a fair, when a criminal was taken to a public hanging and the crowd there knew that he had been sentenced to be not only executed but dissected, they would riot. Again, not against the execution, but against the retrieval of the body by the men who would then sell it to the medical colleges for dissection. So the crowd believed in the importance of the preservation of the body. For them, the manner of death and the treatment of the body mattered. In Linebaugh's words, proper forms of burial were required to ensure the peaceful departure of the dead. Furthermore, and Linebaugh talks about this as well, the violent wrenching away of life through execution imbued the objects involved with power. So, for example, in popular folklore, the noose could be used to cure a headache. Touching the corpse of the hanged could cure skin conditions. A gallows splinter could be used to cure a toothache, and the severed or merely dead hand of a corpse could have a variety of healing powers. Now, those beliefs in the spiritual power of the body, of the executed body, mingled and blended with a garbled understanding of the Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the body. What happens at the second coming if one's body has been dissected? Do you have to live in that state in your new world, in your new life? Now there's a famous scene, if this seems improbable, who would believe this? There's a famous scene in Henry V from Shakespeare in which one of the soldiers imagines the future of his and his comrades' bodies likely to perish violently in the morrow's battle, and he wondered aloud about the responsibility of the king. Was the king to blame if they died in a bad cause, he asked, basically. Now quoting, "But if the cause be not good, the king himself hath a heavy reckoning to make, when all those legs and arms and heads chopped off in battle shall join together at the latter day, and cry all, we died at such a place." Now in that example, you see death not only having power through its finality, but through the Christian promise of another life. Objects could also serve that traditional Christian understanding that reminded people of the ever-presence of death and the requirement that they maintain their souls against the threat not of death, but of damnation. And thus you get in Europe and America what's called the memento mori tradition. That is the reminder of death. And this is my personal favorite, that I found in a cathedral in Austria. And this is obviously a skull and a skeleton. This is a bishop from the 18th century. This is his tomb, obviously, with a glass front. And this is right next to the pews. This is not in the crypt. This is not, somewhere locked up. This is right next to your left arm. While, paying attention to the priest, there's the bishop. In all of his glory. This is a particularly Baroque example of the memento mori, so that when you're sitting through the Mass, you are reminded, literally, of the ever-presence of death. But it went beyond that. I mean, you would have objects as a part of your daily life that would be there as reminders of death. The ring, the skull ring, in the 17th and 18th century, 16th, 17th, and 18th century, was something that was often given out at funerals as a gift to the guests who came to the funeral, that they would wear as a reminder of the ever-presence of death. This one, again, a particular favorite of mine from a museum in Passau in Germany, This is supposed to sit on your mantle as a reminder of the ever-presence of death. And I can tell you, my wife would never allow such an object to sit on the mantle in our house. It's too depressing. This is the neighborhood in Rouen, in France, that surrounds the paupers' cemetery. And every house is a square. So the houses are built around the square. And all of the houses are decorated with the emblems of death, the skull here, and the gravedigger's tool. It's carved into the wooden timbers of the homes. Again, as a reminder of the presence of death. And again, to be prepared for the possibility of damnation. And this spells it out very explicitly. This is from a New England print, sort of wood block carving. It is the point, remember to die, which sounds a little extreme at the top. It is appointed for all men once to die, therefore think upon eternity. I know, it's a bad rhyme. And as I am, so must you be, therefore prepare to follow me. Death is something that needs to be kept close to hand, to be remembered, to be reminded of. Now again, this tradition might seem strange to us now, but as I said at the beginning, cultural responses to death have changed. And we can see those changes in objects as well. And one of the most famous examples, and it's an example used by all archaeologists, is the shift in the decoration of headstones in New England, a shift that archaeologists use to prove the power of what they call stylistic seriation. That is to show how styles change in predictable ways over time. The